Good morning, everybody. I'm Sonia Michelle. I'm Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome all of you here this morning for this very important conference on Muslim political integration and mobilization in comparative perspective, Germany and the United States. This conference is a partnership between the Woodrow Wilson Center and the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, and in a minute I'll turn the mic over to my counterpart at AICGS, Lily Gardner-Feldman. This conference was hatched last summer, about a year ago, when Lily and I had lunch and realized that we both had an interest in Muslim political integration, Muslim integration in general, both in the United States and Germany, and that by collaborating we could have the opportunity to look at these processes in comparative perspective. So it's really a wonderful opportunity for us anyway, and I think Lily feels the same way. Let me just say a couple of words about the Woodrow Wilson Center for those of you who don't know it. The Woodrow Wilson Center is a living memorial, was established in 1968 as a living memorial to President Wilson. And I'd like to say that unlike the marble memorials that you see all over Washington, this is one that talks back. This is one that that has as its mission research and dialogue between academics and policymakers and advocates and activists. And it often is the case that people have things to say about President Wilson, sometimes good, sometimes bad. I don't think we'll be talking very much about President Wilson today, but I think this conference, given the composition of the panels and the fact that we've tried to mix together people from all of those various approaches, academia, public service, public life, politics, and so forth, is very much in the spirit of President Wilson and his life. And just a word about how this particular theme fits in with our program, U.S. Studies. My predecessor, Philippa Strum, who's sitting over here, and you'll be hearing from her this afternoon, was very early on became very interested in the place of Muslims in American society and the place of Arab Americans, and as a result of her efforts and programs that she did, we have a number of different publications that came out of conferences and programs that she did, and copies of these are available outside if you want to get them. So she really paved the way for this kind of for this subject and focusing on this subject here at the Wilson Center, and I think today's program will continue in that vein, and I'm very grateful to Philippa for pointing us in this very important direction. And I'll turn it over to Lily, who has a few words to say.
As Sonia said, I'm Lily Gardner-Feldman. I'm the director of the Society, Culture and Politics program at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, otherwise known as AICGS, which is still a mouthful, but at least it's shorter. I'm delighted to welcome all of you on behalf of AICGS to today's conference. And for over 25 years, AICGS, which is affiliated with Johns Hopkins University, has been committed to a four-part mission. First, to understanding the complexity of public policy issues that affect the German-American agenda. Second, to creating new transatlantic networks. Third, to facilitating dialogue among policymakers, academics, the media, and other NGOs. And finally, to managing differences and then defining and promoting common interests between Germany and the US. And this conference today, I think, is very much hoping to pursue those four aims that we have in general in the Institute. In both countries in recent years, governments have assigned importance to Muslim political participation, most notably in President Obama's Cairo speech, and then in the convening of various sessions of the Islam Conference, the Conference on Islam in Germany. Both developments have been welcomed on both sides of the Atlantic, but I think there's been some frustration and a sense that these developments need to move more quickly. And I think some of the discussion today will address those issues of what can we actually do in practical terms to increase participation, to make participation more effective. And I think that really does talk to the efforts that have been made by governments on both sides of the Atlantic, but not quickly enough, it seems. The comparative perspective assumes both similarities and differences. The point is that through dialogue, perhaps we can understand what the best practices are between these two partners. And when we speak about Germany, obviously, we're also speaking about the wider Europe. This conference would not have been possible without the work of several people. I would like to thank very much Sonia and Michelle for our very fruitful collaboration, and I very much hope that we can continue this in this field or in other fields where there are issues of American and German comparison. I'd also like to thank Kirsten Verklas, Richard Eiserman, and Jessica Riester for their dedication, organizational talents, which many of you have observed and benefited from, and their intellectual initiatives. They pointed us in the way on a number of occasions with respect to speakers, with respect to topics, and we're very grateful to them for that. The conference, from the perspective of AICGS, has been supported by the Helen and Harry Gray Culture and Politics program. And again, like Sonia, I think it's a fine effort between the two institutions. We have some publications outside. The Institute for many years has looked at the topic of religion and politics. And then in the last year, we've done a number of conferences on the integration of Muslims in Germany and the US, looking at the economic and political perspectives, and more recently on religion and culture. So if you're interested in publications, we have them outside. And if you have business cards so that we can put you on our mailing list, some of you may not be familiar with the Institute, we'd be very grateful if you could do that. So again, welcome, and let me thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this today, for being the venue of our conference. Thank you.
You're very welcome. We're really pleased to have you here. Let me introduce the moderator of the first panel, since she won't have anyone to introduce her. This is Tara Barhampour, who's a reporter for the Washington Post. Tara first came to my attention when I saw some of her wonderful articles in the Post about various local Muslim organizations, and she's been on that beat for several years, a couple of years. Right. So her work has really been very, very important in giving us information, giving us insights into the role of a number of different organizations, at least in this local area, about their role in helping Muslims become integrated politically. So she's an ideal commentator for the first, a moderator for the first panel, which is Sites of Muslim Political Organizations. So we'll now ask the participants in that panel to come up, and we will get underway. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sonia, for that nice introduction, and I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then each panelist is going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And I don't know if you all have an order that you'd like to go in.
Ladies first.
Ladies first. Okay, well then we'll start down again with Jamila Yusuf, who's the academic officer of the State Ministry for Intergenerational Affairs, Family, Women, and Integration at in North Rhine-Westphalia, and she works on migration, integration, and international law. And next we have Juliana Hammer, who's professor of Islamic Studies at George Mason University in Virginia, and she is working on a book about gender discourses in American Muslim communities. We have Nahid Samour at Humboldt University. She's a fellow also at the International Max Planck Research School for Comparative Legal History, and she is working on a study of Muslim political participation in Berlin. And finally, we have Corey Saylor, who is legislative director at the Council on American Islam Relations, which is an organization that I and many other journalists depend on for a lot of information and contacts with the Muslim communities in the U.S. So welcome, everybody, and we will start with Jamila.
So thank you very much. I want to begin my presentation and give a short impression of statistical data on Muslims in Germany. We can state that around 4 million Muslims live in Germany. Herein, Muslims with a Turkish origin are the largest group, followed by Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iran, and Morocco. Most of these Muslims came to Germany as guest workers, so-called guest workers, and some as political refugees. As late as in the middle of the 1970s, with increasing family reunification and thus changing perspectives, which led to the necessity of organizing cultural and religious affairs, Muslim immigrants started increasingly to establish mosque associations and organizations at local level. These associations have been mainly organized along boundaries of ethnicity, culture, or language until today. The so-called Hinterhof Moscheen, small backyard mosques hidden from public view, developed. Most of these mosques were registered as non-profit organizations. Since the 80s, we could notice that most Turkish mosque associations joined organizations on a state level, the so-called umbrella organizations, such as the Turkish Islamic Union for Religious Affairs, DITIB. With over 840 mosques, it is one of the largest Islamic organizations in Germany, which was founded as a branch of the Presidency of Religious Affairs in Ankara. This organization maintained very close ties to the Turkish government, which sent Turkish imams to the mosques in Germany. Since a long time, this procedure is criticized because the imams do not know the life circumstances of Muslims in Germany. The second important organization for Turkish people is the Association of Islamic Culture Centers, VIKZ, which brings together Muslims of Turkish provenience who has been subject to Kemalist repression. These two organizations show also very clearly that the political experience and attitude of the Turkish immigrants had a big impact on the organization structures in Germany. 300 mosques are organized under the umbrella of this association. The Islamic Council, with 37 associations, is another umbrella organization led by Turkish Muslims, but is also including non-Turkish associations, for example, from Bosnia. I will come back to this later on. Lastly, there is the Central Council of Muslims with 50,000 to 20,000 members, mainly German Arabs, and German Turkish Muslims. The Central Council was founded in 1994 and since 2006 has been led by a German Muslim, Ayub Köhler. According to the question, what political organizations are most prevalent in Germany, I want to point out that for Muslims it is very difficult to have a political impact in Germany. There is a very different relation of church and state in America and Europe, especially in Germany. In the United States, because of the legal separation between state and church, Muslims do not need official recognition from the state. They are free to build their organizations and then attempt to have a voice in the public debate and in the policy-making process. Church-state relations are quite different in Europe. In France, with its emphasis on laïcism, the separation between state and church is sometimes very strict, while Great Britain has a state church and Germany something between these two concepts. So, while there is a separation of state and religious bodies, there is at the same time cooperation between state and church. To achieve equal treatment and the same rights accorded to the Protestant and Catholic churches and the Jewish communities, Muslim organizations need official recognition by the state. This is especially important for the introduction of Islamic religious education conducted in German public schools, but also would have an important symbolic impact on the Muslims. After Islam was federally ignored in Germany for several decades, a dialogue with Muslims began in 2006 when the former Minister of Interior, Wolfgang Schäuble, initiated the German Islam Conference. German federal states started an official dialogue with the Muslim communities. The participants were selected by the Ministry of Interior. 30 permanent participants were selected by the minister. 50 of whom are representatives of the German government and 50 of whom are representatives of Muslims living in Germany. The latter includes the 4 umbrella organizations and the Alevite community in Germany. However, since only 20% of the Muslim population in Germany are members of any Islamic organization at all, representatives of a modern secular Islam from the private sector, society, academia, and the cultural scene were also invited to take part. A lot of Muslims criticized that some of the participants had an anti-Muslim attitude. For a long time, there is a demand from politicians and that the existing Muslim umbrella organizations should create one organization to talk with one voice and in order to enjoy the same rights as the Christian churches. This was addressed to the 4 large national Muslim organizations which represent around 80% of the mosques in Germany. Because of the high expectations set on the umbrella organizations, these 4 organizations united in 2006 to form the Coordination Council of Muslims in Germany, which represents 800,000 Muslims. But after this unification, the government was still not satisfied with the way Muslims organized themselves. It was said that this organization would not represent the majority of the Muslim population. This argument was viewed by Muslims as rather tactical, once again excluding them from political process. Muslim leaders suggested that 20% of the mosques, which are not part of the Coordination Council, constituting 2,500 mosques, could also be involved as partners in the process. As the first round of the Islam Conference was a hard job, the second round this year began in discord. Muslims once again had no say in choosing either delegates or themes to be discussed. After lengthy debates, Muslim organizations succeeded in placing Islamophobia and religious discrimination on the agenda of the German Islam Conference. As at the first conference, only the Interior Ministry was allowed to decide who takes part, and furthermore, they invited openly secular individuals who have very little to do with Islam. In this way, the Messiah created a majority situation which made the mosque associations and the Muslim organized within them appear marginal. Because of that, some of Germany's foremost intellectuals accused the new Interior Minister de Maizière of dictating from above. An investigation has been opened against one of the functionaries of Milli Görüş, which is the largest Turkish Muslim organization at which dominates the Islamic Council, and that caused the Islamic Council to be excluded from the conference. Therewith, 30,000 members of the Council of Islam are shut out while the investigation is still underway. The Central Muslim Council, which unites Arab, German and Bosnian Muslims, opposed the conference's unilateral approach and dubious content and were thereupon ignored. Currently, the discussion is not finished whether the Central Muslim Council will participate. If the Central Muslim Council refuses to take part, the government's main partner in the conference would be DİTİB, which is strongly influenced by the Turkish government. This, of course, means that the whole conference would have a serious credibility problem. But critics, Muslim and non-Muslims alike, have questioned the conference's effectiveness in general. The months-long proceedings of the conference have suffered from sharp disagreements, including among Muslim participants, and results have been vague. The whole process shows how difficult it is for the Muslim organizations to be accepted as a partner on the federal political level. On the local level, another form of a top-down approach is the cooperation between Muslim organization and state in North Rhine-Westphalia. Since the headquarters of the 4 large organizations are situated in North Rhine-Westphalia, one of their aims is the installation of Islamic religious instruction in state schools. In this matter, the state government had proposed to install local models of Islamic religious education, preferably in Cologne and in Duisburg, in accordance with local Muslim communities. consisting of round tables of numerous mosques associations, as religious education in schools is matter of the Länder. Beside these examples, we can notice several examples of a bottom-up approach too, of establishing religious communities on local level. For example, the Islamic religious community in Erlangen succeeded in establishing Islamic religious introduction in 2 schools in close cooperation with the respective parents, the local authorities, and the university. This local approach seems to be widely accepted. Additionally, mosque associations in some other cities like Dortmund and Bonn have unified to local councils or umbrella organizations to speak with one voice in questions of common interest. So, communication and cooperation have proven to be difficult both on a federal and somewhat on a state level. The government's search for the right addressee showed the mistrust vis-à-vis Muslim organizations. On the other side, Muslim organizations also deal not openly with the authorities. They fear transparency and compromises, believing that the goal of the government is to assimilate Muslims. Muslims thus have the impression that the state is not genuinely interested in having Muslims partners. Also, by looking at Muslims exclusively as part of the Turkish community, many non-Turkish Muslims and individuals and organizations alike are excluded. No research has far been done in Germany on inner Muslim discourses and interactions between the various ethnic groups under the specific condition of the diaspora. So I think time is very much.
Okay, we're going to change the order a bit. We're going to have the 2 German speakers. So the next on the list is Nahid Samour from Humboldt.
Thank you very much for making this gathering possible and for inviting me to talk about issues of political participation of Muslims in Germany and in the US. And it's also a great chance to follow up on a previous conference we had in February in Berlin. So thanks for making all this possible. So before talking about the landscape of organizations Muslims are active in Germany, attempting to influence political processes, allow me to talk about Muslim individuals' experience with the political landscape in Germany. With which topics do they successfully or not enter the political arena? And what kind of political interest makes them join what kind of organization? For the many Muslims not politically active, though politically aware, the question is what keeps them away from getting politically involved? And how has the securitization of Islam in the West affected political participation? And what is it that the Muslim constituency is looking for in those coming from the midst entering politics? To answer these questions, I've picked some of the findings and challenges of an ongoing study titled Political Participation of Muslims in Berlin, which is led by my colleague Rim Spielhaus and myself in cooperation with Jocelyn Cesare from Harvard University. Muslims in this study actually mean the 3 biggest ethnic groups of Muslims in Berlin, which is 1, the Turks, including Kurdish Turks, numbering about 160,000 in Berlin, Bosnians estimated to be around 35,000 to 40,000, and Palestinians fleeing to Germany from Lebanon, estimated to number around 35,000. Breaking down Muslims into their ethnicity is significant for a variety of reasons. 1, approaching the respective communities and interviewing them was possible only because interviewers were from the respective communities and spoke their languages. Not all interviewees felt comfortable enough to express their political ideas in German. On top of it, all 3 groups, though Turks less so, showed reluctancy in responding to a questionnaire, including questions addressing their political participation as Muslims, such as how often they attend mosque, if they are active in their mosque community, or how often they travel to their country of origin or other Muslim countries. These were questions we raised to ask about engagement with the mosque community and about communication, cooperation with the Muslim communities outside of Germany. The hesitance to respond to the questions of that sort is due to what is called the securitization of Islam, i.e. looking at Islam and Muslims through the lens of security, surveillance, and terrorism laws. Something which, for instance, has led to searches and seizures of mosques and mosque goers. So those responding to the interviews did so because there was an assumed relation of trust and understanding on the part of interviewer who all of them come from within the community and were familiar with the language and the politics of the community. And reluctance was also due to an over-surveying of Muslims in general and Palestinians in particular in Berlin. Breaking down the groups also shows differences regarding migrant and refugee status. Many, though not all, Turks came as migrants. Bosnians and Palestinians came as refugees, fleeing wars and discrimination and sharing experience of being uprooted. So for those politically active Bosnians and Palestinians, the political experience that made them refugees, as well as struggling their way through the German political and legal system, were decisive and reiterated moments for their activism. Migrants have a legal status that is different from refugees. So Turks, though not all obviously German citizens, came as, even when they came as migrants, their status was legally clear, the duration of the stay was clearly indicated, it was renewable, and thus relatively secure. Bosnian and Palestinian refugees, however, rarely were granted political asylum, since often they could not evidence individual persecution on the one hand, but also could not be deported given the ongoing war in ex-Yugoslavia or the difficult post-conflict situation. And in the case of the Palestinians, they could neither be deported to Israel or the occupied Palestinian territories or Lebanon, which is not obliged to take back people that are not its own nationals anyhow. So large numbers of Palestinians and Bosnians were granted like an exceptional permit to remain in Germany after having been rejected political asylum. And this temporary permit, the so-called Duldung, offers no legal status, and the refugees are obliged to leave the country at any moment when ordered. This permit thus meant it was only a suspension of deportation for a limited period, and they faced obstacles like restricted freedom of movement to the issuing district or regional county, no permission for higher education, vocational training, or work, and were dependent on public funds. And they had to register with the authorities every 3 to 6 months to renew this permission. Bosnian and Palestinian, why am I saying that? It's because Bosnian and Palestinian interview partners kept repeating that their uncertain legal status made them very hesitant and politically very cautious to engage, given the threat to be ordered to leave at any moment. Even today, where we have roughly like 1/3 of Palestinians and about the same number of Bosnians being German citizens, they all recall the legal limbo they were in for a long time. Breaking up Muslims into the group of Turks, Bosnians, and Palestinians allows you to realize thus that the respective point of reference often is a national one and not always a religious one. So dealing with Muslims as not having only different legal statuses in Germany, but obvious different political experiences in their countries of origin, questions whether it is the religious identity per se that captures the political engagement or lack thereof. So despite these differences I just mentioned, most interviewees of all three communities showed interaction of different sorts with the politics and societies of their origin, while participating and living in Germany through an increasingly accessible means of communication and transportation. They don't leave everything behind. Neither do many of the younger generation when asked. And continuous interaction and being part of transnational communities means that Muslims are exposed and participate at least in 2, if not multiple communities and societies and languages and political zones. So being part of a transnational community politically means that media consumption comprises German and the respective national one, and it means that there's political interest in domestic and foreign policy affairs related to both Germany and the country of origin. So what do political experiences in the countries of origin, both lived and narrated, and in country of residence or citizenship, tells us about how and if Muslim Turks, Bosnians, and Palestinians organize today? Theoretically, there are at least 3 options here. One is to engage in existing organizations set up by non-Muslims, which could be, for instance, the political parties that are currently represented in German parliament, or NGOs that had been previously established by German non-Muslims. Second, there could be self-established and self-running ethnic and religious organizations, old and new ones, like the Turkish community, the mosque organizations, for instance. And there's the option of establishing Muslim and ethnic working groups within already existing German organizations. And the two examples here would be a working group of Muslims in the Green Party, the only explicitly Muslim working group, and the German-Turkish Forum in the CDU, the only explicitly ethnic working group in an existing political party. So political engagement in all three types of organizations is still perceived by Muslims as not fully satisfying, neither their needs nor their interests. And all three types of organizations are actively seeking for more Muslim participation. Now, when interviewees were asked what existing parties and organizations established by non-Muslims could do to attract Muslims, they made the following remarks. One, the German political landscape, or for the German political landscape to be more welcoming to Muslims, they should, or Muslims call for more role models that they could relate to. They criticize that those Muslims active on either the federal or state level barely connect to the Muslim communities and often express opinions meeting the interests and perspectives of majority society and or remain silent on issues that are of concern and of interest for Muslims. So those Turkish and Arab members of current federal or state parliament, for instance, were not considered role models. When asked who their current role models, political role models, were, both younger and older interviewees referred to personalities in Turkey, Bosnia, Middle East, and and Palestine in the Middle East, but not to any German role models, or role models in Germany, let's put it that way. Those already politically and socially active amongst interviewees articulated that they do not want to be limited in the public acceptance to domestic, social, and educational local projects only. They also want to be acknowledged and heard for when it comes to foreign policy issues that is of concern to them. Just to give you like a recent example, Germany had just appointed their first minister on a state level, the Turkish-born Aylan Özkan. The female Turkish-born Aylan Özkan as a social affairs and labor minister. And the moment she supported publicly the idea of Turkey becoming member of the European Union, the CDU was very strong and clear about making her taking back these words in public. So when it comes about voicing things that that concern foreign policy issues, that's when it becomes really difficult for, at least in this case, Muslim Turks, Bosnians, and Palestinians. Currently, some political parties are trying to attract Muslims, or as they call them, migrants, through inviting them to help shape domestic political issues like social affairs, school, and integration policy. However, with limited success. Rallying around domestic politics was voiced as not being the right trigger to gain Muslim members. They also miss parties and NGOs addressing issues of anti-Muslim racism domestically and internationally. So how about the self-established, self-organized ethnic and religious organizations? Those interviewed who preferred to be organized around ethnic and religious issues ask the German public to be heard and have their work more acknowledged, for instance, through public appreciation, financial support, public corporations, as well as being consulted in decision-making processes. The German public should acknowledge that self-established ethnic and religious organizations have the potential to produce role models, but Germany needs to publicly appreciate these people so that they can pull others into their mostly volunteer work. When it comes to those who support the religious or ethnic working group idea, they refer to similar working groups like the group of the Jewish Social Democrats or the Catholic Greens. Group-related interests should not be looked at with suspicion, but in the tradition of competing with a multitude of group-related interests in society. Bosnian reactions to separate Muslim working, or to have separate Muslim working groups, however, were they at times rejected that idea given the experience of being marked as Muslims in ex-Yugoslavia. So what is it that all three groups actually consider to have a stifling effect on political participation? All of them mentioned that Muslim mosques and organizations are, or what stifles them or has a chilling effect on their political participation, is that Muslim mosques and organizations are put under surveillance by the German Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the Verfassungsschutz. The role of this Verfassungsschutz in forming public discourse about Muslim organizations and their acceptance had a devastating effect on the representation of individuals and groups. Individual members of organizations are under surveillance and they are denied citizenship, as just confirmed from the Federal Administrative Court in 2009 regarding members of the Turkish group Milli Görüş. Naturalization was also initially rejected in the case of two Muslim members of German leftist parties and organizations. Even for those Muslim or like religious and ethnic groups not under surveillance, this has a very chilling effect on becoming politically active and expose yourself to media scrutiny. There is also lack of appreciation of Muslim organizations, a kind of organizational or Muslim organization bashing going on in Germany, actually, both by the media and to some extent by state authorities. Muslim organizations and their members are portrayed often as dogmatic, as Islamizing German public discourse, as apologetic and not honest about their political goals. So Muslims in Germany have the impression that the political will for effective participation of Muslims is lacking. What German public opinion is demanding is Muslim participation on the local social level aimed at integrating Muslims into German society, aimed at mitigating the frustrations on the social, educational, and employment level. But what Muslims are not expected to do is to affect decision-making processes on German foreign policies unless, well, you belong to the Iranian opposition. Muslim participation in local and social issues such as neighborhood communities, social and educational issues are actually high, as the Open Society Institute's recent publication on Muslims in Berlin has documented. Those active socially have voiced their interest in also doing more political work and influencing political lines that go beyond the social projects. But they are discouraged to do so, both from German counterparts as well as from their own their own Muslim colleagues, saying that any political involvement will have them to either concede and make compromises on what is really important to Muslims, or they would have to deal with like a very kind of high media scrutiny. But reducing Muslims to kind of local fireworkers only does not meet the assumption that people have multiple identities, and religion only being one of them. And more often than not, it is the ethnic identity, individual and collective, that trigger political participation. Reducing Muslims to local domestic agenda fails to see Muslims as part of a transnational communities with families and networks, not only in Muslim home countries, but also, for instance, in the US and Australia and Canada. So reducing and limiting Muslims to their religious identity often does not do justice to their political interests. And looking at Muslims as Muslims does not help either or neither to tailor attractive, welcoming agendas into the existing political structures. Thank you.
Thank you, Nahed. Now we move on to our American contingent, and we start with Juliana Hammer.
Thank you. I'm actually German representing the American contingent, so I'm confused today. And I wanted to thank Ilana and Sonia for inviting me as well, and taking the risk of having somebody speak on political organization who is not a political scientist and looks at things somewhat differently. And what I want to do in the very short time is two things. One is a number of sort of introductory thoughts And then I want to move on to talking about something that I know a little bit more about, which is the connection between political participation and media participation, but also media representations of Muslims. And I have decided to work with a very broad definition of what political organization means, which for me includes a lot more than what we typically perceive as organizations in the plural. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, action networks and temporary forms of political organization mobilization. And as one of the questions for our panel, and I have no intent to answer all of those questions, just for the record, one of the questions had to do with the role of the internet. And I would assess at this point in time that we have not done a very good job in studying the role of the internet in political mobilization. It's something where researchers across the board, not just in the study of Muslims, are sort of lagging far behind in understanding the dynamics of a medium that itself is constantly changing. And so we have small studies that sort of try to capture what the dynamics of that are. Historically, Muslim organizations that we would describe as Muslim organizations in the sort of more narrow sociological sense also range very broadly, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. We have associations, professional associations of Muslims. We have lobby and representational organizations. We have cause-oriented organizations, and we can think of mosques as religious and somewhat political organizations as well. And I don't want to or can't give you a history here, but at least some of those organizations date back at least to the 1960s. And it's very important to remember that organizations that were founded in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 80s, in the 90s, and post 9/11 all come with their own sort of historical baggage of being a product of a particular point in American history, but also in international history. And some of these survive in sort of larger or smaller form, and new ones are formed. And these organizations also, to a degree, and there are better studies on that, reflect the demographics of American Muslims. I will not say more than one sentence about the actual numbers, because many of you probably know the estimates of the number of Muslims in America, in the U.S., range between 2 and 12 million, which obviously is very helpful for any kind of discussion of what they do and don't do and who is doing what and how many people are involved. And it's also really obvious that there's a lot of politics to the demographics, and so I'm just going to stay away from saying any more about that. Mosques as religious organizations in the American context date even further back than what we would describe as political organizations. The first mosques, purpose-built mosques, date to the early 20th century. And here, too, we have a dynamic of primarily, especially in the early 20th century, mosques were vehicles for internal communal organization and for religious practice, obviously, but also for community building and for identity preservation. And mosques have, according to studies that we have, engaged in outreach and participation to the larger American society. However, for the most part, they are not the hotbeds of political engagement that they're often made out to be. The estimates that indicate that, 20% of American mosques are financed through Saudi Arabia and thus immediately suspicious for developing terrorist ties. These are pretty obvious exaggerations, and again, there's a lot of politics to that. Obviously, post 9/11, Muslims have experienced surveillance, like in the German context, suspicion on contact for, and sort of a very complicated net of stereotypes and perceptions and expectations, a lot of security fears, and mosques are under surveillance. And so there would be, shall I say, the least intelligent places to engage in suspicious terrorist activity because they're very obvious and very well watched. I would argue, if you look at Muslim political organizations, it's really a dizzying array and a really large number. And it's actually quite difficult to understand how they sort of interact with each other, what their purposes are, where individuals, prominent individuals, are involved in more than one or two. And I would, contrary to the way that is often discussed, both in the media and in academia, argue that it's actually the diversity that is the strength of Muslim communities in the American context, despite the fact that both the state level in the American context or on the federal level and Muslim communities themselves continuously talk about unified representation, which is also very similar to the German context. The state is interested in a unified voice that simply doesn't exist, and Muslim communities are interested in unification in order to increase their political capital and their political strength and ability to lobby. I would also venture that it's important to keep asking why, how, and when Muslims organize as Muslims and what consequences that has for their political organization, rather than sort of looking at that as a separate area which, like in the German context, overlooks that Muslims obviously have other identities and that they're people who identify as Muslim and participate in American politics, but not based on their Muslim identity, which brings us to sort of this question of how do we decide who is a Muslim when we talk about Muslim political participation. And now I want to move on to what I'm more comfortable with, which is that I would argue that Muslim political mobilization and integration cannot be separated from media representations and public perceptions of Islam and Muslims, that there's a direct connection. And that's not only obvious when you study political expression of Muslims through the American mainstream media. And I want to focus on two particular examples to make that larger point rather than sort of saying many more of these generalized things. And these are two particular historical examples. I could have picked a number of other ones. Clearly, since September 11th, there have been many, maybe too many particular events and sort of things that have been happening. To think of is the very most recent South Park controversy over yet another depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, which I don't want to talk about, but I can address that in the discussion if necessary. And obviously the Danish cartoon controversy that had its own American dimension to it and its own responses by Muslims. But what I want to focus on is two incidents in which individuals that were immediately identified as Muslim committed acts of violence in the American context. And I will explain why I chose those particular ones. One is the murder of Asia Zubair in February of 2009, and the other one is the Fort Hood shooting in November 2009. Asia Zubair was killed by her husband, the founder and director of Bridges TV, the first American Muslim television channel, according at least to some, whose sole purpose was to build bridges between American society and Muslim communities and to build understanding. In the media, and I was apologizing to Tara for generalizing in that way, it actually needs to be, this topic needs to be addressed sort of in much more nuance, but he was immediately identified as Muslim. And he wasn't just the husband who killed his wife, he beheaded his wife, and so one of the headlines read, "Muslim man beheads his wife." And many other ones were sort of along those same lines. You can imagine the rest of the articles. So there was a lot of media attention. The initial debate, interestingly enough, focused on domestic violence, on the killing, the murder being sort of the end of a spiral of domestic violence. And it wasn't until a few days later that it turned into a debate about honor killings. And so clearly, particularly Muslim traits of why this happened. The domestic violence debate was actually, for the most part, carried out in the context of American issues with domestic violence. So the killer was Muslim, but there were more debates about this being a general issue in American society. So Muslims weren't singled out as the only ones who have domestic violence issues. And the honor killing twist, which came from the feminist majority, I think, sort of introduced an element which Muslims felt compelled to respond to in public. The other thing that happened, and I think that's a very important and very interesting point to look at further, is that Muslim organizations and individuals immediately responded through media, through various kinds of media, to the domestic violence discussion, addressing or acknowledging the fact that there is domestic violence in Muslim communities and it needs to be addressed. And obviously they tried to reject vehemently the honor killing sort of angle of that. What also happened is mobilization of Muslim communities and a renewed interest in discussing domestic violence in Muslim communities, including the creation of new action networks to discuss that issue and this sort of reinvigoration of existing organizations that have been working on this issue for about a decade now. The Fort Hood shooting, again, the shooter was identified as Muslim and by name relatively quickly. We have a similar pattern of immediate condemnation from Muslim organizations and individuals, paired with also the immediate expression of fear of scapegoating. Come sort of right next to each other. Muslim organizations also engaged in fundraising efforts for the victims of Fort Hood and in outreach through mosques and organizations. The media focus, or part of the media focus at least, was on Nidal Hassan as connected to Muslim organizations, particular ones, a particular mosque, and particular individuals eventually. And again, Muslim organizations felt compelled to distance themselves from that. What I would argue is that is a number of things. I don't want to sort of make policy recommendations, but I do think that Muslim organizations, the ones that do engage with the media and do lobbying, are often still not very well prepared for how to respond to when something like that happens. When events like that happen, and it can be expected that the coverage is going to be that way. So rather than complaining about the coverage, there need to sort of be action plans for what to do about that. The bigger issue I see is that Muslim organizations and prominent individuals, when they respond as Muslims, while dissociating themselves from acts of violence, reestablish the connection between Islam and violence. So if they decide to speak as Muslim organizations to something that a Muslim individual has done, they reinforce the connection. And it's a conundrum that they have no choice over, because if they don't respond, remember post 9/11, they are accused of not speaking out against terrorism. So they're sort of between a rock and a hard place in these responses. And again, public perception, media are very important for that. Let's see. And I would also argue that in these particular cases, and more generally, two things are very obvious to me. Muslim groups and organizations have become more savvy at interacting with the media. To go back to the Danish cartoon controversy, the American responses are all in the framework of the way civil society works. There were all the channels and avenues that individuals and political groups in American society are supposed to use in order to change public perceptions and public opinion, rather than violent demonstrations or demonstrations at all. Muslim mosques and community organizations took out ads in newspapers, talked to editors, talked to law enforcement, in order to sort of keep a handle on that. Yes, and just to sum this up, as I said in the beginning, I do think that the diversity of organizations, forms of engagement, really in a dizzying array of political entities are actually the strength of American Muslim communities, and that both the secularization that Nahid was talking about, that American Muslims, of course, have experienced as well, and a host of legal issues associated with that, but also public opinion and media representations have had a very strong impact on the way Muslims organize as Muslims or decide not to. Thank you.
Thank you, Yelena. I think that's a very good opening for Corey Saylor.
I hope so.
Good morning. I was taught a long time ago that one of the most horrible things you can do in any social situation when you're first meeting somebody is talk about religion or politics. So, walked into the room this morning, had an opportunity to meet Abdul Qadir over here, and we immediately started talking religion and politics. And we also immediately started disagreeing with each other in a very healthy and friendly way. I welcome that, and I know he's going to be speaking shortly, and I also welcome that from this conversation. Once we finish talking, I expect I will say some things you disagree with. Let's go ahead and feel free to disagree with each other in a civil way. Always enjoy those kind of conversations. I do want to start off with a little bit of background, and then I'll work my way through 5 points, hopefully fairly shortly. I'm used to speaking in places like Fox News where they start yelling at me after about 9 seconds, so I do tend to be kind of brief. The demographics thing, 100%, nobody really knows. I was going to say the argument is between 2 and 7 million. I'd love to see the 12 million purely for political reasons. But the key thing there to understand is that usually consistently it breaks down into 1/3 of the community is of Arab background, 1/3 of the community Southeast Asian, 1/3 of the community African American. And part of what that leads to is we have a really hard time agreeing on what our issues are going to be, because we basically have representation from every Muslim place in the world. Talking about political organizing, to see where we are now, you have to understand, I started this work in the mid-90s, and back then the conversation was, should we get involved? And literally you would go to functions, anybody who's familiar with the Islamic Society of North America, they have a big convention every year. I would go there would be a line standing in front of me, people to yell at me, voting is haram, you can't participate in the system, it's not a Muslim system. That conversation basically ended after September 11th. Everybody gets it now, why we have to participate, why our religion supports our participation. But what that means is that we're very new at it. You also have to look at the fact that, it was referenced that some of the early Muslim groups were founded in the 60s. That would be the Muslim Society of North America, Islamic Society of North America. But the real sort of public policy focus did not come until the 90s. So Muslim Public Affairs Council, CARE, the American Muslim Council, all of that stuff just got started. So we are very much the new kids on the block. Then we get September 11th. Currently, what you will see is very, very solid local organizing efforts in some places. So go to Southern California. They have members of Congress who will respond fairly quickly to their issues because they've been out there, they've been seen, they've made strong alliances with other organizations. Same as in places like Michigan, places where you have a good, solid, large Muslim community, and they've been able to organize. But what you do not see is any really good, substantive, consistent national effort. It kind of comes and goes. Throughout the election cycle, you'll see the American Muslim Task Force, which is a kind of umbrella organization that can endorse candidates, but really not everyone's behind it yet. So it's an idea that's evolving as our community goes from organizing on the local level to the more national level. You also currently see some things that I think are pretty amazing phenomena. We have 2 Muslim members of Congress post-September 11th. If you had asked me in 2006 when we would see the first Muslim in Congress, I would have told you 10 or 15 years. And then Keith Ellison pops out of nowhere to some of us. I mean, he was very well known locally and won his election handily and with an excellent campaign. I think that says some great things. The Muslim community really did pitch in behind Congressman Ellison and support him. But it also says great things about the voters in the United States, particularly Minnesota, that they're willing to look at somebody's issues and not always necessarily his religion. So the organizing is there. It's just a very local effort at this point in time, and we need to see a more consistent national effort. The barriers to this organizing, it's been mentioned quite strongly already. The securitization of Islam, we'll use the academic term for it right now. I have other words that we sometimes don't use. But it leads to some really interesting phenomena like radiation detection trucks being driven up to mosques. If anybody remembers that from a few years ago. I mean, how do you as a community respond to the fact that the Department of Energy is driving trucks around, monitoring your mosques, monitoring your places of religious assembly to see what kind of radiation levels are coming off of them? Politically, what it results in is a phenomenon where you have politicians who will put their arm around you. You know, I love you, you guys are great guys, but when it comes to the picture, would you guys kind of stand over to the side a little bit? They frequently don't want that association, because what happens is politically, if you're seen as being too close to the Muslim community, you must be weak on security. So that's what happens. And we saw that attack on President Obama throughout the election. Not only was it just, he might be a Muslim and therefore he's not eligible, but you're too close to the Muslim community, you must be weak on security. There's also a thing, in talking about barriers, there is a group of people out there who profit from post 9/11 fear, and they're well organized and they put out a lot of academic type papers. You see them on Capitol Hill all the time. So that becomes a barrier. There are groups that believe that our growth will hurt their interests, and so they do expend energy to make sure that we don't get access. And then, frankly, and this came up in Abdul Qadir and I's conversation, there are just people who plain old hate Muslims. Welcome to it. There's always going to be people who just plain old hate, fill in the blank. So we have to deal with that as well. And again, I want to give you another specific example of what that leads to as we try to organize politically. I'll leave it to my academic colleagues to give it a nice fancy name. I call it Islamic whack-a-mole. And if you don't know what whack-a-mole is, it's a game at carnivals. A little head pops up and you have a club, and your job is to hit down as many of them as possible. And we see this again and again and again. Somebody who's Muslim will start to rise up and be recognizable in government, and here comes the club. So Suhail Khan, he's working in the White House post 9/11. He becomes Al-Qaeda in the White House. Mazen Asbahi, he's appointed to outreach for the Obama campaign. He may at some time have shared oxygen with somebody who may have had radical views. He's kind of politely asked to step aside. Rashad Hussain is appointed OIC envoy from the United States. All of a sudden, he's getting attacked. Dalia Mogahed, again, keep running it down. Congressman Ellison, one of his opponents, I love this quote, "We beat them on the Barbary Coast, we'll beat them now." That was one of her campaign statements. The Barbary Coast being a reference to Muslim pirates back when the United States was founded. So that will continue to happen. I'm not complaining about it. Welcome to politics. I have a friend who says very clearly, in D.C., we are all red meat on the barbecue, right? That's the way it works. It has happened to every minority before us. Italian Americans, when Kennedy ran for president, they said the Pope might be running the country. Jewish Americans, some of the things. I remember seeing a book with a picture in it from the 50s. It was a sign outside a store that said, "No dogs, no Jews." I mean, so they had to come from that point to gain political access. African Americans, their story is well known. I love, however, in terms of when you're looking at Muslims, we have to examine the Japanese American experience. They are the only other community who was blamed for an attack on this country, right? And they had to go on, they had to deal with the attacks on their community, they had to shine, and it took them 40 years to really establish their place and get the government to recognize that what was done to them was maybe not entirely appropriate. I also point out they were put in internment camps and we weren't, so we're definitely ahead of the curve and growing as a nation. So where are these sites of organization? I would actually say the mosques are not one of them. And there's a reason for that. I'm really glad I'm not in Germany where I have to get government approval to get into politics. We have our own barriers, though, and that is that most of our mosques are what's known as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It means you can't get involved in partisan politics. So you really cannot be a true site of political organizing. You can organize around some issues, but the 501c3 thing limits you to the point where I can say I don't like racial profiling, but I cannot say I think you should pass the End Racial Profiling Act. Right? It limits that. So really the mosques, people meet there, they find people who are similar in thought to them, but the actual organizing is not usually under the umbrella of the mosque. We have our nonprofits, and I kind of already said it's all very new, and most of us also are 501c3s. So one of the things that you need to see coming down the pike from the Muslim community is more national level professional organizations that are not nonprofits that can engage in partisan organizing. Locally, you will see some excellent groups. But I'll use one here in Virginia that's a great example, the Virginia Muslim Public Affairs Council. Great organization. They were doing good organizing. They were putting money into the system. Unfortunately, it was one guy who was very energetic. He kind of got tired of it. He's now started up a farm raising goats. So a lot of our partisan organizations end up being these personality-driven thing, and then the guy burns out after a while, and somebody else has to pick up the banner, and there's always a gap once that torch is passed. You will also see it within the parties, within the Democrat and Republican Party. Not shocking statistic that post-September 11th, prior to September 11th, it was kind of even between Democrats and Republicans in the Muslim community. There has been a massive surge away from the Republican Party. At our last poll that we did before the last election, about 8% of Muslims were self-identifying as Republican. About 40-something% as Democrat, 40-something% independent. Now, that's fine. People can choose their party as they wish. I do always point out that for the Muslim community, politically, for us to ally with either party permanently is a massive mistake. And I learned that from the African American community during the Kerry election when a congresswoman who was African American, we were saying we can't get the Kerry campaign's attention. And she said, you know why? Because they know they've got your votes. That's what they do to us, the African Americans, right? They know they got our votes, so they don't really have to give us that much. So in the interests of organizing, it's great to have people within both parties. You have to. But on the whole, we have to maintain that sort of distance so that each party feels obligated to give us some of the things that we want so that they in return get the support of the Muslim community. What are some of the things you're going to see coming in the future? Hopefully a national consensus on an agenda for the American Muslim community. I already mentioned we have Muslims from everywhere, which means we have every issue on the table. And I look at the conservative movement as a model for this. They have, and this is a statement that I was taught by somebody in the conservative movement, that there are three main things: guns, God, gays. Right? That's how you can define the conservative movement. Second Amendment rights, ability to practice religion the way they see to it, struggling against full inclusion of rights for people in the GLBT community. I don't necessarily agree with all of those things or in one way or another, but I do understand the idea that we as a community, kind of across all organizations, have to come up with what are our top three issues. So I think that will unite us and help us push forward. More full-time professional partisan organizations. For the overall community, again, that thing, having people both within the Democrat and Republican Party, but no full alignment. And the last, more campaign-like modeling in our institutions as well. We have a lot of people who are volunteering in campaigns right now. It's excellent. What we want them to do is come into the Muslim institutions and bring that knowledge with them. The last thing I want to say, just to sort of cover up on the issue of the day, foreign policy. Again, it's an issue that comes frequently in fits and starts. So I'll speak specifically for CARE as an example of the overall focus of our community on foreign policy. The Israel-Palestine issue, we almost hardly ever touch it. Not out of lack of concern, but we're primarily a civil rights organization, and we're overwhelmed with just trying to deal with the cases that we get. And so what happens is you have a situation like Gaza last year, where the community gets really emotional, and you'll see us work on the issue for a short period of time. And then the Gaza situation passes, and we kind of are forced, just because of resources, to go back to focusing on civil rights cases, people getting discriminated against. So again, what that means is that somebody put it very politely earlier, we don't have a good impact on things. I would just say simply we don't really have the ability to move the needle at this point. It will come as there's more focused organizations that's all they do. But for the time being, we're spread too thin to give any one of those issues really the attention that it deserves. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much, and see where the questions go.
Thank you, Corey. So we're going to open it up for questions now, and if you could just introduce yourself when you ask the question, that would be great. And wait for a microphone. And I think there's a question over there. If we could.
Hello, I'm Janann Reed from Duke University. I had a question on the German contingent side. I think one of you mentioned that at the local level, from the bottom up, there had been some success in incorporating religious teachings in the school. Could you explain what you mean by that? How do they incorporate religious teachings in the schools?
Auf Deutsch antworten. Okay, I'm translating in German, and I'm answering in German. Yes. Also Islamunterricht in Deutschland zu etablieren, ist es notwendig, als Körperschaft anerkannt zu sein. Und wir haben es in Nordrhein-Westfalen geschafft, ohne dass wir einen Ansprechpartner haben von der muslimischen Seite, ein Roundtable zu gründen. Dort haben wir halt überlegt, welche Inhalte, also dort wurden die Inhalte bestimmt, und das ist jetzt modellartig in den Städten etabliert worden, islamischer Unterricht.
In Germany, in order to establish Muslim education, you have to be something called öffentliche Körperschaft, which is sort of the public, a public entity. And in North Rhine-Westphalia, it was successful to establish public education without having a single entity from the Muslim community. And there was a roundtable which was organized by the government that managed to establish that, and that is now something that is a role model for other cities and local communities in North Rhine-Westphalia.
I'm sorry, are you finished with it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we have a question over here. Just 1 minute.
Thank you very much. I'm also speaker today in the afternoon. Sabine Riedel is my name, and I want to explain the situation you have mentioned, the problem of recognition of Muslim organization. It is not a problem of recognition because they are existing as associations. The problem is that they are not recognized as a religious group. This is the great discussion in our country. So, and this, if one organization is a religious group with the ability to for education in public schools, it needs a lot of preconditions. You have to publish your membership. It must be clear how many members your church or your religion has. For it's one example. Another is the structure of your organization. Who is the head of your religious group? So, and all these issues are in discussion because the majority of these Muslim organizations are not really religious groups, and this is now a struggle or a problem for the courts. There is something in process. There is a decision of a court, and the court said we have to clear this crucial issue. Are they religious groups or not? And if the court maybe in 2 years have a decision, will have a decision, it is possible maybe that the one or another organization can teach at the public schools religious methods. So this is the point I want to explain.
And if I may add, I don't know if that was your question, but it's because of the relationship between religious organizations, primarily churches, and the state, that there is religious education in public schools. It's voluntary, and it depends on whether parents feel that their children are belonging to a religious community and that they should be taught religion. And so the issue was that increasing numbers of Muslims said, well, if there is religious education in public schools, we want to have our children be taught Islam in these schools.
Thank you. We have a question back here.
My name is Joseph Gordon, and I would like to follow up on Ms. Hammer's remarks related to this. I see you studied Islam at Humboldt University, which, one of the gaps in this education and political integration program is the lack of German-trained school teachers and imams. Did you experience Islamic fellow students? And what is the status of the training of teachers and clergy at the German universities?
No. As far as I know, there is no training for imams in higher education. It's starting in one place, right? Yes.
They just initiated a chair for Islamic theology in Osnabrück in Germany, and they are now big on actually having imam instructions in Germany too. So that's been already established actually, but still in its embryonic phase.
So, but not back when I was there.
Okay. We have a question here.
Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you all so much. This is a question for Mr. Saylor. You spoke about 501c3 organizations, but what about 501c4 organizations? Are there attempts by Muslim 501c3 organizations to establish C4s? I mean, I should translate, right?
Yes.
501c4 organizations are also nonprofit organizations, but because the contributions that are given to them are not tax deductible, they are allowed to engage in advocacy, in not supporting political candidates, but advocacy on issues. And related to that,
like legal defense and education funds.
Right, exactly. Like that's why the NAACP then added, because it couldn't advocate, added the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and then there's a MALDEF, the Mexican-American version, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering whether consideration is being given within the community to something like that, which would extend the ability to advocate on political issues. And related to that, there's an increasing number of Islamic philanthropists in the United States. To what extent are they getting involved in these issues of political organizing or advocacy organizing? Thank you.
Thank you. And forgive me, I'm going to talk D.C. for a second to answer her question. The C4s are also still limited in their ability to impact elections. And so, yes, you can go up on the Hill and you can spend more time advocating specific legislation up to a certain percentage. But what that leaves you is a bit of a gap because you're essentially dependent on how much people like you. Whereas when you're able to be involved on the money side of campaigns, there's unfortunately the reality of there's more give and take. They know that if they help out their community, there are donors out there that want to see that. So you're really frequently, when you're dealing with any kind of nonprofit, you're a little bit stuck. I mean, and even within a C3, the standard rule is somewhere in the area of 5% of your income, or 5% of your, up to 5% of your budget can be expended on lobbying on specific legislative issues. If you take the H election, you can actually significantly increase that, but what you're still sort of stuck with this, Congress people are beholden to other folks that have been working sort of on the campaign side of things for a lot longer, and it's harder to get your ideas through all of the noise in D.C. So when I say that, what I'm essentially advocating is we recognize that there's a need that community-based organizations have to be involved on the campaign side of things. As for the philanthropists, there's also, let me just point out realistically, a reality that within Washington, D.C., there are only 2 Muslims whose full-time job it is to engage the government on behalf of the community. You're looking at one of them here, and then there's a gentleman at the Muslim Public Affairs Council. So we just simply can't cover all the turf that needs to be covered. As for the philanthropy side of things, honestly, and again, I'll address the political side of those kind of investments. A lot of it tends to go home in the immigrant community. So a lot of the wealth, they tend to be more interested in sending it back to their place of origin. We're beginning slowly to make inroads into understanding how impacting policy here can help things back home or can help things with discrimination here. But it's another one of those things we're in the early part of the learning curve.
And we have a question from Sonia.
Thanks. Sonia Michelle from the Wilson Center. This is a question mainly for Juliana and Nahed, but maybe Corey wants to weigh in on this too. You both spoke critically of securitization as a kind of inhibiting force to political organizations or political integration. And I wonder if you could say more about that. I mean, Corey gave the example of all the other ethnic groups in the United States that, you know, basically became anti-defamation organizations, really, who saw it as their goal to put the best face, to present their communities or their groups in the best possible way. And if there are accusations against particular members of groups, and certainly in the case of the Fort Hood incident, I mean, it was clear that there was a radical Islamic, I mean, there was something that the guy had connections to, to terrorism. I mean, he had terrorist or anti-American intent. So doesn't it make sense to try to address that head on rather than to, I mean, it seems to me that using the critique of securitization kind of deflects the issue that there are, in fact, issues that have to be addressed, and that the function of organizations like CARE or whatever other organizations you have are precisely there to be anti-defamation organizations, to present, to try to educate the American public or the German public about the true nature of Islamic communities, so that, as a way of deflecting or trying to minimize widespread prejudice by pointing out the way people, the ways in which Muslims really wish to integrate into these specific societies.
Well, maybe Corey can weigh in on that a little bit as well. I'm hoping with maybe something specific to the way CARE itself has been a target precisely because it is speaking out on behalf of Muslims and against discrimination. I'm not a legal specialist, but what happened to Muslim communities in particular areas after 9/11, which is blanket imprisonment, registration, are all things that even affected those who were not directly, who weren't in jail even for a day. So one aspect of it is simply fear. It's being afraid of standing out as a Muslim because it will get you the attention of various kinds of security apparatuses. That's one aspect of it. The second one is that when I was speaking of surveillance, there's not just surveillance, there's also infiltration, particularly of mosques by FBI agents, including actual provocations in which people in mosques were provoked into things that then were declared to be acts of terrorism. Some of this is more local. You have post 9/11, particularly in New Jersey and around New York. You have the mosque issues with the FBI, particularly in Detroit. One other aspect that I think is important to remember, and that's, I think, parallel to Germany, is that according to one of the last surveys, more than half of American Muslims are foreign-born and thus come from societies with different experiences of political participation or the danger thereof. And so there is already fear to engage in the political process and in a sort of distrust of government. And I think all of that combined, that's not to say that there aren't individuals or a certain percentage of people among American Muslim communities who have a tendency or are interested in harming Americans or harming the United States. The problem then becomes, like with this sort of larger war on terror, what to do about that. And I think the pressure that is put on Muslim communities as sort of distinct entities to identify such individuals, it's much more sort of murky and gray and nuanced than saying, oh, somebody said this and thus we're going to report that person to the FBI. It's way more complicated than that. And the securitization is in part about conviction for suspicion, not actually doing something, which obviously is something that is happening in the American context. People are being convicted of planning to do something rather than actually doing it, which is legally, and again, I'm not a legal expert, but that's a really difficult sort of, that's a slippery slope to go down, and the U.S. has decided to go that route. So again, I mean, if you want to be polemical about it, what are Muslim communities supposed to do to address the potential for people having issues with American foreign policy or having issues with American imperialism, what have you, or having religious issues with America? It's sort of to me, it always looks like no matter what they do, it's never going to be good enough and convincing enough. Does that make sense?
I hear you. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily agree, but I hear
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Then if you don't agree, that'd be a great conversation for afterward. But there is, I'll speak directly about Karen, about a couple of other issues. We were one of the early Muslim organizations to encourage our community to work more closely with law enforcement. So we were doing things, bringing the FBI into mosques for, get to know each other kind of things, mid-90s. And to give you an example of how things have changed, I mean, beyond just the court issues you're talking about, in Southern California, the head of the FBI office there was asked, are you putting informants into our mosques? And he said, no, not at all. And there was a guy going around in mosques saying things that were very disturbing to the community. So our executive director in Southern California reported him to the FBI as a person of interest. Look, this guy's going to the kids and he's saying things to them. Several months later, it comes out that guy was the informant that was in the mosques, and he was going around provoking the kids. So we're reporting the FBI's informant to the FBI, which leaves us in this kind of situation of, wait, guys, you're telling us this, and you're doing this. So we have egg on our face because we've been telling the community, look, engage with these guys, and now not only are we finding informants in the mosques, but we ourselves find ourselves an unindicted co-conspirator in a case in Texas. Unindicted co-conspirator, for anybody who's a lawyer in this room, is a really scary sounding term, but the prosecutor in the case said it was done as a legal maneuver so they could introduce evidence into the trial that would otherwise be deemed hearsay. We have no real way to challenge that designation, and it's scary, right? And that's, that leads to that thing I was talking about where the politicians go, love you guys, stand over there when the picture's being taken, right? So on that front, yes, there is a critique, but what exactly, when that's the situation, what we end up doing is we end up doing what a civil liberties organization does. We have to attack the use of informants. We have to attack this thing where we have members of the community calling us and saying, the FBI came to me, they said there's a problem on my naturalization form, and I can either get deported or I can report on the community. So what do? Let me just give you two very quick examples. One, our trainings that we do, media trainings. We actually, we'll bring kids in, this is how you talk to the press. Tara, we would never tell them talking points or anything, how specifically to deal with reporters. I teach them how to deal with elected officials, with the whole idea behind that being give these kids a way to feel like they're a part of the system and like they can affect the system. And I know it works because I've seen a number of kids leave our trainings and go on to successful things. And, using the Fort Hood example, a kid came up to me at one of those trainings right after Fort Hood, and he was honestly confused. He asked a question that a teenager would ask. I was terrified. I started looking around immediately. But he was like, don't you think that guy was right for killing American soldiers? They were getting ready to go kill Muslims. Were I not in that room, I could not have given the answer I did, which was no, absolutely not. It's not acceptable. We have to obey beyond what Islam says about those kind of things, we have to obey the laws of the land. And if you really don't like what's going on in those wars, go join the peace movement. Hell, they're totally disorganized. They need the help, right? And he did that. So again, those things are very important. Second thing, and I always just bring this up as a, whatever we do, we can't win kind of situation. January 2006, a reporter was kidnapped in Baghdad. The people who kidnapped her, said she had 48 hours to live. I got a call from a congressional office. The reporter's parents lived in that district. Can you guys just issue a statement condemning it? That night I was on a plane on my way to Baghdad. So we went beyond just the statement. We went to Baghdad, two of us, and condemned them and asked for her release. We were there within the time period that was given. We come back, you guys don't condemn terrorism enough. It's like I went in 2006, idiot white guy in a suit walking around Baghdad is not the best way forward in that place, but that's how strongly we feel about pushing back against those people that take our faith and use it for extreme purposes. But that message never gets out. It's the Fort Hood, Anwar al-Awlaki, those are the guys, unfortunately, that get the press.
And Nahed, could you give us a little German perspective, please?
In Germany, too, the German Islam Conference, Muslim organizations and state representatives decided to do more on law enforcement cooperation. And on a local level, there are very vivid contacts there in mosques and in all states in Germany. However, if you enter this securitization debate, then it should go both ways, because Muslims then also asked the federal and state officials to provide them with security. They wanted security in their mosques. They want security, whether it's mosques, cemeteries. That's what they want too. And these interests and needs were not met. So if we're talking about security here, all have to be in the boat. The other thing which goes also along those lines of conviction for suspicion is the case of Murat Kurnaz, which was a big thing in Germany. He is a Turkish, he's a Turk born in Germany, and he was held in Guantanamo for way longer than needed, which means that once Americans have clearly informed the German authorities that really there isn't anything against this guy and you can take him back, Germans kept on for, I don't know how long, was it? Endlessly, I don't know. Endlessly they kept, the Germans just kept him in Guantanamo. So the message for Muslims back was very clear. Even if you are innocent and all you have is a long beard and you look Muslim, no one is going to help you out. So really the suspicion thing got everyone very stifled, and it has a very chilling effect. So when it comes to security, really everyone has to be on board, and the Germans definitely are not delivering that for Muslims in Germany.
We have a question back here.
Yeah, my name is Gregory Gumsong from Catholic University. I used to live in Europe for a long time before I came here in the Netherlands. And as a young lawyer, I was a little bit involved in the Muslim community there. This whole issue of the securitization of Islam, I find it interesting that it seems to me to have come up at a special time. A special time of a kind of a growing weariness in the West towards minorities, a growing weariness of this crisis in the neoliberal state. So I think we need to see it against that. But apart from that, a few questions. What are the different Muslim groups in Europe? Are they starting to work together? Are they trying to reach across the borders to work? I mean, there are a lot of talks, for example, in the Netherlands. Do German and Dutch Turks work together on issues concerning both domestic and foreign policy issues? And is, for example, also since Turkey is so involved in the German Turkish community, are they trying to, for example, Israel does with the Jews, or other groups have done in the United States, I mean, Germany, etc., with German Americans, are they also trying to encourage the German Turks to become more involved in, for example, the issue of Turkey potentially joining the European community? Are they trying to have an influence of that, or are the problems between the different countries and stuff like that complicate the ability of these groups to work together?
Yeah, would one of our German...
Do you want me to go first and then you... Oh, okay. Sure. Okay, I'm just going to address that question, and if you want to add anything. Well, okay, so when it comes to Muslims in Europe, then again, we are dealing with different laws in place. Both for Muslims as of being migrants, refugees, citizens, when it comes to, I mean, the headscarf issue is regulated differently all over Europe. So really, I mean, discrimination issues, I mean, yes, there's this overall anti-Muslim racism, but also like those laws combating anti-Muslim racism can differ, though there is also an EC directive handling that more or less uniformly in all of Europe. But still, the discourse, I mean, one, we don't speak one and the same language. I mean, part of the difficulty of doing the study in Berlin on political participation was that we needed people who speak the native language of these people. You know, I mean, not even the German command in all cases was good enough to express complicated political ideas. Now, obviously, that is not a problem so much in France, right, where we know migrant communities do not have any of the language difficulties that they have in Germany. And that is also less of a problem in Britain. So we are really dealing with a variety of different settings here, legally, language-wise. So that's made it just very difficult to do cooperation, which does not mean that it's very, very badly needed. And obviously, I mean, in that sense, I guess, in a certain way, Muslims are also reflecting the very European nature. You know, like, I mean, Europe itself does not take a unilateral step in a lot of foreign policy affairs either. You know, so of course that's reflected on Muslims in a certain way as well. When it comes to, I mean, you brought up the German take on Turkish accession to the European Union, which is something that strikes me too. I mean, you would assume that given that there's so many Turks in Germany and that Germans have an interest to integrate Turks in Germany, they would basically also, you know, maybe lobby in a way on their behalf within the European Union, but that is totally not the case. You know, the Chancellor had made it very clear that she wants Turkey to have like a privileged partnership position with the European Union, but not have a full, be granted full accession. So instead of assuming that, you know, the state would have a particular kind of closeness to its own kind of migrant community, that is unfortunately not the case in Germany at all. And again, as I just mentioned, the newly appointed Minister for Social Affairs and Labor of Turkish origin, she got very, very bad press, both in general and by her own party members, for even talking about it openly.
All right. We have a question here.
Michael Kürzig. I'm interested to know the reaction, since there are 4 women on the panel and 1 gentleman over there. What is your reaction to what's going on in Belgium with the banning of the burqa? Sarkozy's comments that the hijab or the burqa has no place in France. And generally, is that a reaction by the Europeans that they're scared of what's going on? Is that really a gut reaction? Also the fact that no minarets will be allowed in Belgium. What is involved in that? That seems to be something that we hear in the press quite a bit over here. How do you see it?
Also ich denke, dass diese Entscheidungen einen sehr starken symbolischen Effekt haben. Es wird ja so begründet, dass diese Frauen, dass es verboten werden soll, um diese Frauen zu schützen. Also dieses Argument ist in meinen Augen wirklich nicht ernst zu nehmen. Frauen, die Burka tragen, aus dem öffentlichen Leben zu verbannen, ist eine wirklich absurde Maßnahme. Wenn man diesen Frauen etwas Gutes tun möchte, sollte man sie eigentlich darin unterstützen, die öffentlichen Plätze aufzusuchen, wenn man wirklich Kontakt zu denen aufnehmen wollte. Ich denke, das sind Maßnahmen, okay, die Angst der Bevölkerung aufgreifen, um eine bestimmte Wählerschicht auch zu mobilisieren. Aber sie haben nichts mit der Realität dieser Menschen zu tun. Es gibt zum Beispiel keine Studie über Burka-Trägerinnen, was sie denken, warum sie es tragen oder sonst irgendetwas. Es gibt keine Kommunikation mit denen, sondern sie sollen ausgeschlossen werden aus der Gesellschaft. Ich denke, das ist so die Tendenz.
Okay, those recent laws to ban the burqas, that are women wearing burqas in the public sphere, have a great symbolic effect, and the argument behind it is, to prohibit those women, or to prohibit women with burqas in the public space is to protect them. But in my opinion, that's not really the real argument behind it, or it's not the serious argument behind it, because it's a very absurd method. If you want to engage with these women, if you want to help them, then it's not useful to ban them from the public space and marginalize them, but rather to bring them into the public sphere and talk to them and engage with them. So these bans and these laws just pick up on the fear of the population, and just to look at, or to mobilize voters from a very far right segment of the voters, or who have these fears, and it has nothing to do with reality. And it's actually a lack of studies that have been done on women who wear burqas and what they're thinking and what they're interested in. And so there isn't really a communication with women who choose to wear burqas or who wear burqas.
Anyone else want to address that?
I'm reluctant.
No, I will also just throw in that it always seems very strange to me that you would focus on a piece of cloth as being a threat in some way, shape, or form, when almost every depiction you have of Mary, she's wearing some kind of a head covering. You have other different religious groups that have head coverings. So you usually have to look at what is the political motivation behind it. Because I'm not a Belgium expert, but I'm going to take a random guess that they're not under threat of having the burqa take over as a fashion item there. So, it's probably pretty minimal. Just like in Sweden, at least Switzerland, there's only like 5 minarets in the whole country. So it's not like it's taken over. I think what political parties do is they find something that they can use that's symbolic, that focuses people's fear, and then exploit that. So it definitely has far more to do with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's important to look at sort of the chronology of when these debates come up and who brings them up in a particular country context. And I think you will see that there's usually sort of a local trigger for why this is deemed to be the best symbolic expression of other kinds of fears. And I mean, Muslim women have been the symbolic token for reforms in all kinds of things, particularly in terms of their clothing, for at least 2 centuries. So I would say that the debate in Quebec as well is sort of related to national and domestic politics for the most part. And I would venture, even though I'm typically not comfortable with these comparisons, that European countries, if you want to sort of put them all in the same pot, have more and different issues with what you would, in quotation marks, describe as Muslim culture, because it's culturally different. In the American context, I don't think that's the primary drive, because everybody is sort of culturally somewhat different. But I think in Europe, this fear of being taken over by people who are different, in the public sphere in particular, is prevalent. And it's very easy to work with. It's very easy to mobilize for all kinds of political purposes.
And just to let you know, we do have about 10 more minutes for questions. We're going a little bit over. We have 2 questions over here. 1 minute for the microphone.
Andreas Wüst, Mannheim University. Just a reaction to what Namit Samor just said on the government support for Turkish membership in the European Union. So this is certainly a party politic issue, because the Schröder government was clearly in favor of that, and now the Merkel government is against it. So I would be very careful in saying that the German government is principally
at least
against Turkish membership in the EU.
I thank you for your contribution, but I want to ask you, is there a possibility, we are speaking about the engagement of Muslims in the political system, so is there a possibility in Germany and in the US to participate as a Muslim beyond these organizations? I think it is very important to discuss about our political systems and the possibilities also for Muslims who are maybe not only so hard convinced in their religion, maybe a little bit secularized. It's also possible. And how are the parties, the political parties, are discussing this issue? For example, you have mentioned, Said Samur, that our political parties, the CDU and the Green Party, they are discussing openly about this issue, but also the Social Democrats. They have so-called Muslims in their organization as a long time. So, which role play these Muslims there? Thank you.
And I think we can discuss that about Germany and the U.S. So why don't we start with Germany? And then
Achso, Entschuldigung. Also ich bin selber auch in dem deutsch-türkischen... Also ich bin selber in dem... Achso, hier gibt es ja auch welche, die Deutsch verstehen direkt, Entschuldigung. Ich bin ja selber im deutsch-türkischen Forum der CDU. Also ich bin selber in dieser innerparteilichen Organisation aktiv. Ich denke, dass es Sinn macht, auch diese Interessenvertretung innerhalb der Partei zu haben, weil man natürlich im direkten Kontakt mit den politisch Aktiven über bestimmte politische Maßnahmen besser sprechen kann, Maßnahmen entwickeln kann. Und man hat eine Brückenfunktion auch zu der Community, der man die Parteipolitik näher bringen kann, um sie auf diese Art und Weise zu mobilisieren, sich auch politisch zu partizipieren. Da haben wir diesen Effekt der Role Models, dass wir sozusagen innerhalb der Partei auch Migranten haben oder Muslime haben. Wenn die aktiv sind, dann kommen die Muslime, es ist näher für die Muslime zu sagen, dann können wir uns auch aktiv in dieser Partei beteiligen. Ich denke, das ist die Funktion und das ist auch ein guter Weg. Ich persönlich hoffe, dass wir irgendwann diese extra Institution innerhalb der Partei nicht mehr brauchen, weil wir dann als Migranten auch in den in den Kreisvorständen oder in den höheren Stufen der Parteien vertreten sein werden, so dass wir nicht extra Organisationen brauchen, sondern ganz offensichtlich auch partizipieren können.
Okay, I am myself in this German-Turkish forum of the CDU, that is the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, and this is sort of the inner, and it's like a forum in within the party, and I think that it makes sense to have these inner party structures to develop measures and to talk to not only the party members, but also to have a bridge function to the communities and to explain the party and the party's ideas to the communities and to help mobilize members of the community. So just going back to that effect of having role models within the parties to increase active members of the Muslim communities to also engage in the parties. And hopefully eventually we won't need those extra steps and these extra forums and these extra structures, because Muslims will naturally participate in the party structures and will sit on boards and will be in the higher functions. But so hopefully in the future we just won't need that extra step.
Take the I know you
really, that was one of the best summary on what she said, basically. I would also add, though, that the important thing for Muslims beyond our institutions is vital. We need Muslims in both parties. Right now, the Democrats are in control. In a few years, it'll go back to the Republicans. It always does. It goes back and forth. So you have to have participation in both parties. Also because that's the way things work. You want to get things done, you have to work within the party. We need Muslims in think tanks. We need Muslims in working in campaigns. Because it does two things. One, it brings knowledge into the community. We need Muslim journalists also desperately. It brings knowledge into the community, but it also gets it out there that people see us not as Muslim. And I mean, not me, obviously, because until I tell you, you can't tell. But somebody who's obviously Muslim, they become a colleague that they know, who they share ideas with, and it's no longer just the stereotype they learned from TV, but it's a human being with real ideas, and that really goes a long way to offset the stereotypes about Muslims that exist.
Well, and to add to that, I said in the beginning that I think we need to maybe spend more time, at least we as academics trying to understand when Muslim individuals participate in politics as Muslims and not in some other capacity, when sort of their Muslim identity becomes significant for how they represent themselves. And I think these are complicated dynamics, especially when you're asking about people that in the European context are sometimes called secular Muslims. We do have indications that especially younger American Muslims were sort of nudged or pushed into acknowledging their Muslim identity post 9/11 because of certain kinds of experiences. And sometimes that means that they became religiously more observant. And I would say more often it means that they recognized their Muslim identity as part of how they are perceived by others. And these are individuals who sometimes are individuals who have started participating in sort of who are involved in political activities, not necessarily formal organizations. And there isn't sort of like a Muslim community litmus test for how Muslim you have to be in order to speak on behalf of the community. But that's also, I would say, an open issue sort of to be addressed. Like when are you fit to represent the Muslim community or Muslim communities plural in the media, in various kinds of political settings. I mean, I think that's sort of a contentious internal issue of who decides who is a Muslim, and it's also an external issue.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so what I'd like to do is just take a few more questions all together in a group, and then we can answer them as whoever likes to step forward and answer it. We have one question here, another one in the back. If there's anyone else?
Yes, thank you. Nini Sharikin, House of Creative Writing, LLC, a media company. How strong is the sense of anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant in Germany? Because not long time ago, if I'm not mistaken, there was a politician originally from Congo or Angola that was told by a political group, Christian White, to go home. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we've got two more questions here and one more in the back.
Let me ask you one last question. We've talked a lot here about religion, ethnicity, inter-ethnic differences, etc. For example, in the Netherlands, when I was there, the Turkish community was seen as a real problem community. Eventually, as they became more economically successful and they became kind of more integrated, that was pushed to the background. Are German Turks who are better off, more educated, wealthier, are they having somewhat different experiences in the community, or are they largely experiencing the same thing as the German community, which would tell us a lot about what is going on in the society?
Okay, and two more up here.
Sorry, I was in the midst of completing my question. Speaking of Muslim
identity. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Sharon Forrest from Women in International Security at Georgetown. Speaking of a Muslim identity, and Samuel had spoken about how there was criticism of a Turkish imam being installed in a German mosque. How much do you see or observe that identity being one of a universal Islamic ummah, and how does that affect political participation in a nation state?
And one more over here.
Hi, my name is Jenny Leitz. I work for BAE Systems. I contract for the Department of Defense. I'm going to go somewhat controversial, and I'm going to ask that when political integration begins, that will then bleed over into the legal realm. And we've talked today about kind of the fear that there is surrounding Muslims throughout the world right now. And I guess my question is, do you see Sharia law becoming entangled within the United States, within Germany? And if so, how does that work with the constitutions and the laws? And how does that compare to what's happening in Britain?
Okay, thank you. Well, we have a big range of questions here, so. So would anyone like to address, first of all, the question, and I think the first two questions we can maybe take together, how strong is anti-Muslim sentiment in Germany, and then how much have people become assimilated? I think you were asking in the same way that they eventually became more assimilated in the Netherlands. And then if anyone would like to also bring in the question, which I guess, could be the other end of that, which would be how likely would it be that Sharia law would be an issue in Germany under the U.S.? And Juliana, you look like you have something to say.
Do you want to start with the German part?
It's a free-for-all.
Go ahead, German ladies. I actually think your question are sort of related. The issue of whether Muslims with a sense of loyalty to a transnational Muslim community that we call Ummah again, which is a fashion term. Muslims didn't use that for many centuries, sort of in the way that it is used now as a global transnational community of people who have a lot of things in common or have sort of common goals. I think that's sort of at the center of the debate of American Muslim integration and what Germans tend to call assimilation, which is a word we don't use in America anymore. Is precisely the question whether you can be patriotic and American and Muslim and loyal to a transnational Muslim community at the same time. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, because these can potentially take place in very different realms, so to speak. Many other Americans have transnational ties as well, and are not anymore questioned on whether that is an impediment to their loyalty to America. If you want to look at it from the economic angle that the gentleman in the back was talking about, American Muslims are statistically at least economically well integrated and more successful than the average population. And if that is sort of a factor of integration, then yes, American Muslims are very well integrated into American society, and their foreign policy issues that they might potentially have don't override that. I think all the sort of civil society engagement that we've been talking about here is an indication of that. So I wouldn't sort of see that as an overarching fear, which is not to say that there aren't individuals who are more Muslim than American. And in the polls, Abdul Qadir probably has the numbers sort of at his disposal. I don't remember the numbers, but I think there's significant numbers of American Muslims that say they're American first and Muslim second, or they're both at the same time, and they don't want to pick which one they're more.
Yes, but interestingly, comparatively, many evangelicals, much more evangelicals.
Right. Yes. Yes, indeed. So, like in comparative polls, evangelical Christians would say they're more evangelical than American in higher numbers than Muslims would say that about their religion. And to your question, I'm going to read that as asking whether there are any thoughts or attempts to find ways to integrate Sharia law with the American legal system rather than Sharia law taking over America. The second is not a fear I would engage in or that I would try to sort of feed. I don't think that's going to happen. The application of Islamic law to minority communities in non-Muslim contexts is actually very well regulated. And Corey pointed it out briefly. The overarching principle is you follow the law of the land. That's not to say that there aren't Muslim communities that would like to have, at least on the communal level, instances where Islamic law should be applied. But the U.S. is actually not a context where any sort of strides have been made in that direction. It's not a primary community concern, and it's also important to recognize that Islamic law, in principle, regulates all aspects of life. So you can apply Islamic law to your prayer practice, which is regulated by Islamic law, but not to other aspects. So to give you an example from a gender context, polygamy is illegal in the American context. Thus, Muslims are strongly encouraged not to engage in polygamy. That's not to say that there aren't polygamous marriages in various communities, but it is very clear that that's not according to American laws, and it in fact breaks American laws. I don't know if that really sort of takes away your concern, but I don't think that that's one of the sort of major avenues of lobbying or any kind of community organization that is actually taking place. Unlike in other contexts in the UK, for example, where you had that debate, and in Canada, in a local context, in the US, that's at this point not a concern. Introducing Islamic law?
No, there you would. It is not being discussed within the German context, but I would like to share with you something that happened in Germany, which is that a German non-Muslim judge tried to apply her understanding of Muslim family law on Muslim laws of divorce by not allowing a Muslim wife to get a divorce because of domestic violence. Now, her understanding was, well, domestic violence is something embedded in Islamic law that does not give you a reason for divorce, right? So that made like a huge uproar in Germany, because who is this non-Muslim who has never studied Sharia trying to apply Sharia in her understanding and doing everything wrong you could possibly do wrong, you know? So in that sense, no, and neither do we have the non-Muslim judiciary ever successfully applying Sharia law, nor actually Muslim communities rallying for that in any way. So the situation is not comparable to Britain or Canada in any way. So we don't have these kind of Sharia councils or the ideas. So that doesn't exist.
And maybe to add two things that sort of came to my mind. One is, of course, you've had several decades of interpretations of Islamic law being used for cultural defense in American courts. That certainly is happening. Most of the time it's not a very successful strategy, but there was a time when it was actually quite successful in the 80s and 90s to sort of argue that people are culturally different, not necessarily religiously, but culturally based on sort of a particular interpretation of law where experts come in. That's certainly there. And then the other thing that I would want to point out is that with the exception of 2, occasionally 3 countries, most countries we describe as Muslim countries only apply Islamic law, if at all, to family and personal status law. Most Muslim nation states have secular laws in place in almost all areas of legal interpretation that are based on European laws, legal systems, and as I said, family and personal status law are the only ones that have been retained, and even that's not true for all Muslim countries.
Thank you so much. We have run out of time, but it's been... Did you have one quick... Okay, one quick.
Ich würde gerne abschließend noch zu der sozioökonomischen Situation der Problemgruppe der Türken würde ich gerne noch etwas sagen. Es ist weiterhin so, dass die türkische Bevölkerung sowohl was Bildung, Arbeit, Einkommen angeht, schlechter gestellt ist. Aber im Vergleich zu Amerika muss man hier sehen, dass sogenannte Gastarbeiter nach Deutschland gekommen sind. Also die Immigranten, die in Amerika sind auf einem höheren Bildungslevel. Und dadurch, das kann man also nicht 1:1 vergleichen. Der zweite Punkt ist, dass wir haben eine Studie gemacht vom Ministerium aus und dort ist rausgekommen, dass selbst Jugendliche mit gleichen Abschlüssen, mit migrantischem Hintergrund, haben nicht die gleichen Arbeitsmarktchancen wie Nicht-Migranten. Also das zeigt uns auch, ja, es gibt die Problemgruppe, aber es gibt auch Diskriminierung auf dem Arbeitsmarkt. Und was wir auch herausgefunden haben, unser Ministerium, dass es eine sehr hohe Zahl von Unternehmern gibt. Also die Migranten in Deutschland, besonders die türkische Gruppe, ist sehr gründungsfreudig. Und da kann ich auch mit Stolz sagen, dass die Frauen eine 3-mal höhere Gründungsquote haben als die deutschen Frauen. Und Sie bilden im Vergleich zu den deutschen Frauen auch öfter aus. Damit also pushen sie sozusagen die Wirtschaft, aber sie unterstützen auch den Nachwuchs. Und das würde ich gerne auch als ein bisschen positiven Abschluss vielleicht noch hier einbringen wollen.
In conclusion, I just wanted to come back to the socioeconomic situation of sort of the problem groups of the Turks in Germany. And in this, we can see that the education, the income level is definitely lower in Germany. But if you compare that with immigrants in the U.S., you also have to look at why and how they came. In Germany, they were temporary guest workers that came through temporary guest workers programs, and they had a lower education level to start with than people in the States who primarily came with a very high education level and immigrated to the States. There's also a study done from the ministry in North Rhine-Westphalia, which looked at youth with the same identical level, German youth and youth with a migrant background, and they did not have the same chances in the labor market. So there is also a discrimination coming from the enterprises and the companies that has to be addressed. However, if you look at entrepreneurs with a migrant background, there's a much higher degree of enterprises being founded by them, and especially women are 3 times more likely to found an enterprise than German women. And also, not only do they found these enterprises, but they also educate younger people, so in a greater degree than German women. So I just wanted to end on this more positive note and say not everything's bad.
Okay, well, we have one more, maybe.
Well, I know I only have 2 minutes, and I'm very unfortunate that I will have to bring it back on a more negative note, because someone brought up the anti-Muslim sentiment, and I just want to give you an idea of what's happening right now in Germany. One is, right now we have a debate on how to call what's going on. One, is it called Islamophobia, or should we call it hostility towards Islam, or should we call it anti-Muslim racism? So at least within academia and activism, there are debates on how to what wording to choose for what you called anti-Muslim racism. And so the debate is it, or the debate goes along the lines, does what we see, is it xenophobia in a different dress, or is it racism, or does it have structural elements of anti-Semitism compared to anti-Semitism in Germany in the 19th century, which is something the Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism in Berlin in Germany actually is proposing. So just to give an idea, one, what is the wording, and according to which kind of structural elements are people trying to figure out what's happening there? And when it comes to numbers, in 2006, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is one of the big daily newspapers, commissioned a survey on, well, now the question is what you call it, right? On anti-Muslim racism, and they, around 80% said of non-Muslim Germans said Islam is foreign to Germany, and I can't figure right now how the percentage actually, but more than around 40 to 50% said, I do feel uncomfortable with Muslims being in my country. Also, there is this study of Wilhelm Heitmeyer, called group-related hostility, group-related hostility, that said because there's something new, which they call Islamophobia, they introduced an Islamophobia scale to measure what's going on there in the society, because they really don't know exactly how to, what is this element that has elements of xenophobia and racism and resemblances to anti-Semitism. And there, too, the numbers are pretty high. So a lot of people are aware that anti-Muslim racism is not a phenomenon of the right. It has reached the midst of German society. And Wolfgang Schäuble, the former Minister of the Interior, also, I guess, in a way, very troubled by these numbers, said this is why we definitely have to make more of a concerted effort, and we really have to get the media on board, because this constant perpetuation of Muslims and violence is really something that's making any effort, both on the local and the state and the federal level, very difficult to succeed.
Well, thank you to our panelists and to our audience and participants for a very stimulating debate, and I hope we can continue it in the afternoon or the later in the morning. Thank you.